In this video, we're going to show you how to remove and replace the cranks on your bicycle. There are a myriad of different styles and designs out there, but we're going to focus on the two which are the most popular. Shimano Hollowtech, such as on this nice Orbea, and also Sram Gxp. Now, if you have one of the other designs or styles out there, then we're going to aim to make a video covering that in the future. We'll begin with the Shimano Crank, which is a two-part system. So this means you have the chain rings and chain set on the drive side connected to a spindle, and then the second part is this non-drive side crank arm, which can be removed and is separate from the spindle and drive side crank. Now, the tools that you'll need for this job are as follows. A Shimano preload tool. This is a specific park tool one, but there is also a plastic Shimano version of this as well. A 5mm Allen key or hex key, a torque wrench, and then a couple of tools which are useful but not absolutely crucial are a nylon or rubber mallet to help knock the crankset out if it's stiff, and also a flat head screwdriver or something similar. The first step is to take your 5mm Allen key and begin undoing the bolts on the non-drive side crank arm. To undo these, turn them anti-clockwise and also undo each one a little bit at a time rather than just undoing, one of them all in one go. With the retaining bolts on the non-drive side crank arm loosened, you'll then take your Shimano preload tool and use that to remove the preload cap. Again, turn it anti-clockwise. Next, you'll use your small screwdriver or something similar to just push the retaining clip away from the axle spindle, like so. We're now going to remove the non-drive side crank arm. With everything loosened and the retaining cap pulled off, you can simply just pull on it and it should detach itself from the spline. A little detail that I wanted to make you aware of is if you look at the spindle here, you'll see a small hole in it. This is the corresponding hole for the retaining clip that we pushed out of the way with our small screwdriver. It has a little pin built into it, and that pin slots into that hole. This is a little safety device built onto the crank to stop it falling off as you're pedaling along should the bolts fail. To remove the spindle and the chain set, first change gear so that the chain is on the inner smaller chain ring. Next, we can lift the chain off the chain ring and put it onto the bottom bracket shell. You should now be able to remove the drive side crank and chain set by simply wiggling it through and then pulling it through the frame. If it's a little bit stiff or stuck, then you may want to use a nylon mallet and just give the spindle a very light tap to just help get it through. And there we go. There's the half of your chain set. For reassembly, make sure that everything is nice and clean. By taking your chain set out, it's also a really good opportunity to clean some hard to reach areas around the bottom bracket area of your bike. Then you want to apply some grease to the spindle just behind the chain rings on the drive side, and then also on the splined area on the non-drive side. Making sure that your chain is still on the bottom bracket shell, you can then install the chain set and spindle like so. The way I do this is not to push the chain set all the way in, but sort of 90% of the way in. This just makes it a bit easier to lift the chain back on to that inner chain ring. Then, with the chain on, push it the rest of the way. Before installing your non-drive side crank arm, first make sure it's clean and then apply some grease to the splines where you're going to be clamping it. Next, you're going to attach it onto the spindle. Make sure it's in the opposite orientation to the drive side crank arm. Sounds obvious, but I have seen people reattach crank arms not doing that. With the crank arm in place, we'll then take our Shimano preload cap and preload tool and simply wind that on by hand and then finish it with the tool. This preload should only be finger tight. You don't have to tighten it really hard. It is made of nylon, so if you were to tighten it really hard, it would, well, fail. The next step is to push the little retaining safety clip back into place and then tighten the two Allen bolts that hold the crank arm. To do this, begin with the Allen key and then switch to your torque wrench. It's important that you get the torque correct on these bolts, as it's a matter of safety, and Shimano recommends that they're tightened to 12 to 14 Newton meters and that they're done evenly. If you followed those steps, then your chain set should be on securely and properly, but give it a visual inspection and just double check everything's okay. Give it a wiggle and just check that there's no play in it and everything's as it should be, and then you should be good to go. If you've changed your chain ring size as you've changed your chain set, then you probably have to change your chain as well to make sure that it's the correct length, but we have a separate video on that. Now I'm going to move on to Sram Gxp. Sram Gxp is also a two-part system, but instead of using those two external bolts on the non-drive side crank arm to hold it in place like Shimano, they use an internal self-extracting bolt that's in the spindle here. Now to remove this, we need an 8mm Allen key. In addition to your 8mm Allen key, you'll also need a torque wrench with an 8mm head on it and a trusty nylon mallet, which isn't essential, but it is useful for insertion and removal of the crank. To remove the crank, we need to undo the single internal bolt using an 8mm Allen key. Now, if you notice, there's actually two sockets in this. There's a 10mm Allen key socket and an 8mm socket. Some people make the mistake of trying to undo the 10mm one, but if you actually look inside it, there is a smaller 8mm one. The 10mm one is for the self-extracting cap on the crank arm. We don't need to loosen that. That needs to be tight and in place, and that is what we extract against when we undo the 8mm bolt. To undo it, place your 8mm Allen key in the end, and I find that if you actually orientate it like this with the crank arm, we're going to turn the Allen key anti-clockwise to undo it, and by orientating it like this, you can pull against the Allen key and the crank arm and pull them together to get it to undo. There we go. Should feel some resistance at first, and then it should loosen. Once the bolt starts to slacken off, you can use the bulbed end of the Allen key to continue loosening it off. Now, as you remove the crank arm, make sure you take note of any spacers or washers that are then applied behind the crank arm and in between the bottom bracket. Once again, with the chain on the inner chain ring, it's easier if you then just pull that off and get it to rest on the bottom bracket shell. And then you should be able to simply pull the crankset through. Again, this is where mallet can be useful if your chain set is sticky. One quick thing that I want to point out to you now I've got the chain set off is that this is a Sram Gxp spindle, as I've mentioned, so you can see the width of the axle there. Now, if you have a BB30 SRAM spindle, outwardly it can look very similar to the untrained eye, but to undo it, it's actually on the drive side and not the non-drive side, as is the case with this one. It's an important distinction. Before reassembly, make sure that your components are clean, and then you can apply some grease to the spindle and also the spline area on the end of it as well. You can simply slide the crank back into place and then reinstall the chain back on the inner chain ring and then push it the rest of the way, and you'll see the splines pop out the non-drive side like that. When you install the non-drive side crank arm, really make sure that it's 180 degrees to the drive side crank arm. This is especially important with this kind of design, as it is possible to install it at a slight angle so that it's not quite right, which is less easy to do with Shimano because of that retaining pin that you have to put in place. Simply slide it onto the spindle and then begin tightening it by hand with the Allen key. To tighten it, you simply turn the bolt clockwise. Again, we're using the 8mm bolt. I'm going to finish it by getting it to the correct torque with my torque wrench, which is recommended between 48 and 54 Newton meters, so quite a lot. And again, we're turning clockwise to tighten it. Now that's all installed, spinning nice, everything's tight, but you should always make sure that it's installed correctly. Give it a visual inspection to make sure it looks right. You know, check there's no play in the new chain set, and then also just go through your gears and check that everything is as it should be. So there you have it, 2 of the most common types of cranks are removed and reinstalled back into place. Hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what kind of chain sets you'd like us to do videos on in the future, as we will show you how to remove those and install them as well. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.